Next up is the breakdown, which sounds like this. And this is quite a simple section. It's quite influenced by a lot of metal breakdown styles. The drums are the same drums as before, just a different rhythm. So there's not a lot to show here. I'm making a lot more use of snare rolls, however, especially at a few points like these, where I'm combining rolls with my samples with easy drummer rolls. However, moving down, what I've got is my sub bass. And again, this is Zeta. It's the same patch as before, but I'm now automating the channel pitch envelope, so it sounds like this. And as I said, it's the exact same synth, so there's not a lot to show there. Moving down, however, we've now got a new bass sound, which is my LFO bass, and this was made in Harmor. It sounds like this. You've probably heard that in a lot of tracks, and basically that entire sound is just made using a phaser. But again, sound design is really something for another time. So it pitches up in exactly the same way as the sub bass, and in the case of this LFO bass here, what I've done is I've taken off quite a lot of the low ends, including some of the lower mids. I've then used a stereo enhancer to make it full stereo by inverting the left-hand channel as it's a mono sound, and then I've compressed it a bit. But this is only one part, and it's the starting point for the rest of this sound, which is here. And what I did was I recorded the part into Edison, and again I put it through Harmor, and the main processing I put on this was some tremolo. I turned the depth all the way up and then adjusted the speed and did 3 different speeds, which sounds like this. So that's with a low speed tremolo. And this is a high-speed tremolo, which I felt sounded better on the higher notes. And then a very low-speed one for a few final notes, where it pitches down a lot. And the effects are, again, a high pass, but this is a bass sound, so I am using some of the low end on it. It's just a high pass to blend it in with the sub bass. Then taken off some of the top end to make space for the original LFO bass, which I've blended in. I've then compressed it and put another EQ on, this time to take out some chunks around the snare, around the top end of the drums, and to give it some bite. And this sounds like this when it's put together. There we go, that's that synth, and that is most of this part. What I've also used, however, is some more of the Mortal Kombat synth, and there's not much to say about this one because I've already shown it to you, except maybe I've done some chopping up on the second half. But there's not much else to say about this section. It's quite a simple one to put together, and it was more about the rhythm of the track than throwing as much stuff in as possible. Now we're on to the second part of the breakdown, which, as you can see, I've labelled something else, and that label is still there from when I was still working on the track, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to put here, but this is the second breakdown. So again, I've got some fairly simple drums here. And they're quite rock influenced at this point, but again, not much else to show because I've already shown how I produce the drums. Then more sub bass, and I'm making a lot of use of portamento slides in this section. I've also introduced a bass drop sound, which I've made in 3xos, and that sounds like this. The sub drop is just a sine wave which drops in pitch. And then I've put a little bit of fruity fast distortion on to add some harmonics, but I've also sent a little bit of it off to the sub distortion channel which the original sub bass is also going through. So you end up with quite a spacey sound there, and it's less about the sub bass and more about the tone of the sound. Next, I've got the bass guitar which has made a return, and as I said with the sub, I've made a lot of use of the portamento, and as you can see, it's exactly the same part on the sub and the bass guitar. Moving down, there's the Mortal Kombat staccato sound that I've already used. Then I've brought back in the modern talking lead, which sounds like this. And something I've introduced at this point, which I didn't mention earlier, was the limiter which I've got on here, which is actually sidechained to my second sidechain channel. And this is the one with the slightly irregular sidechain rhythm, and gives it a nice pumping vibe against the drums. Moving down again, I've now got some strings. And this is playing off Garriton Personal Orchestra 4, and sounds like this. And this layer basically fits in with all the other instrumentation, so it makes more sense when you hear the rest of the track with it. I also now introduced the arpeggio for the first time, which is a hard pans left and right arpeggio which I've made in Synth 1, and it sounds like this. What I have done is I've got two of these arpeggios. One is on an arpeggio drop channel and one is just called arpeggio. The main difference in this is in terms of the volume, because I wanted a louder arpeggio during the drop, but I wanted it to be quieter in the next section which I use it in. And I could have automated this, but I found it easier at the time just to create a new channel. The other big difference on the drop version is that I've rolled some of the low end, as I always do, and I've taken out a chunk in the mid-range to make some space for the other synths. Again, this is a fairly stripped back section. It's more about the feel of the whole thing, it's quite a vibey section, but once you put it all together, it sounds like this. Then finally towards the end, I have a wind-up coming in, which I also used at the end of the drop, called Wind Up 3, which this time I've made in Harmless, and sounds like this.